And he got his EDD from Harvard University, and he's an associate professor of science education at the Curtis School of Education at the University of Virginia. And he has been doing a lot of interesting work in science ed, and his research has been supported by multiple research grants, and also including several from National Science Foundation. And we are lucky today to have an opportunity to get know about his work. And so here you go.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to come and listen to me speak about this. Feel free, if you have any questions or anything, just to speak up, and you won't be interrupting me. I speak extemporaneously, and so if I practice, I usually screw up, but I find if I don't practice, things work out better. Because then I don't like forget something and then have to go back over it. What I'm going to talk to you today about has to do with some work that I've been doing lately on the idea of measuring and tracking student engagement. And what this, I didn't spell FOCIS incorrectly. Once again, this is I'm a child of the National Science Foundation in many ways, and so it's an acronym for everything, right? So it's all alphabet soup. This actually stands for the Framework for the Observation and Categorization of Instructional Strategies. And so some of this work that I've been doing lately stems from a paper that I actually did back in 2006. This study is one that took advantage of a long-term longitudinal study that was carried out by the National Center for Educational Statistics. And they actually asked students in 8th grade a really terrific question, which is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I don't know if you know this about these types of surveys. They carry one out about a study like this every 5 or 6 years. They'll start a new one or something. This is an unusual study because they track students over 4 different waves, and the last wave was carried out about 12 years after the initiation of the first wave. This is also the only the NELS 88 survey was the only one that was carried out with 8th graders. All the other ones have been with significantly or older students in 10th grade until the most recent one with 9th graders. And so in this study, what we looked at was the relationship between what students said in 8th grade that they wanted to be when they grew up and the college degree that they earned 12 years later. There's a significant amount of drop-off in terms of the number of students that were in the sample, but that said, there were still about 3,356 students that were part of this sample. And what we found using a multinomial logistic regression was that in life sciences, when we took a look at the students that reported that they expected a job in science in 8th grade, that they were roughly twice the probability of actually earning a degree in life sciences. And when you look at physical sciences and engineering, you notice that there's more of an impact in terms of the mathematics achievement scores. Now, bear in mind, these are 8th grade mathematics achievement scores. There wasn't a dependence that you would see there for life sciences, not entirely surprising. And also, it's not that surprising that there is a relationship here for physical sciences and engineering. But something that you'll notice right away here is that the probability rises substantially as the mathematics achievement scores go up. That said, if we look at a comparison between the predicted probability of students from the non-science expectors group with the predicted probability of the students from the science expectors group, you'll see here even the highest achieving student in the non-science expectors group is predicted to have a lower probability according to this model. what's that suggesting? Does it mean that they really do honestly have a lower probability? Probably not. But what it does suggest is, it gives us some indication that even if an individual's achievement in mathematics is fairly, well, let's just say it's not that strong in early on, that they are in all likelihood mitigating that by doing something along the way. That there's something that's happening there. So I don't believe this suggests that mathematics is not important by any stretch of the imagination. What it does suggest to me that mathematics is very important, but that said, it's not the end all and be all. There's something else that's going on. As part of that study, we also carried out a survey of scientists in the physical sciences, and that's chemists, chemical engineers, and physicists. And we asked them a few questions. And we also surveyed graduate students. And the reason for this is because I wanted a confirmatory data set. So we asked scientists and we asked graduate students. We know those are two distinctly different groups of individuals, but we also know that the graduate students will someday become the scientists. So you have a confirmatory set built in that way, and they're mutually exclusive. So we asked this question: when did you first become interested in science? And what we were finding here is that about 80% of those two groups, and you see how very closely matched the data is. Okay, about 80% said that they were first becoming interested in science in elementary school, which matched very well with the previous study. But here's something else that's interesting too. When we asked them, when did you first become interested in the topic that you eventually got your doctorate in or were working in graduate school? What we found here is this happened during high school. And so it's not a punctuated process. This is something that's happening over time. These are individuals that are exploring what's going on in terms of their own personal interests and where their careers were headed. Now, looking at this kind of data, I began asking myself the question of how can you track or how can you measure student engagement in some way? I mean, if you were to go and look at an out-of-school time program, they're so different one to the other, right? And examples of this include, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the FIRST robotics competitions. So that's very popular right now, right? And in that kind of activity, that's fundamentally different than, say, for instance, 4-H programs, and which are also different than Girl Scout programs. And so here you have all these different types of programs, but is there a way that would allow us to extract information for comparison between these groups? And so rather than looking at content, which so many of these programs are focused on, I decided, no, let's look in terms of the learning activities that the youth are being engaged in. So let's take a different path here. Rather than focusing on whether or not it's engineering, like in a FIRST robotics competition, or whether it's environmental science, like some Girl Scouts and Boy Scout activities may be involved in, or in any of these kinds of content-focused inquiries, I decided let's look at something that's more pedagogically based, right? Let's look at how these activities are engaging these youth. Now, some of this approach came as a result of qualitative research that we've done on FIRST robotics competitions. And I'll give you an example of this. What I mean by qualitative research. There was a particular student that was on the FIRST robotics team. And the student was asked by my researcher, why are you here? What brought you to this team? And the student was really frank. He said, when I was in 8th grade, I got a knee injury, so I couldn't play football anymore. But I still like competition. And so when I saw this FIRST robotics team, I thought I would join it. And he had been part of that FIRST robotics team for 5 years at that point. Okay. No, actually, 4 years at that point. He was a senior. Okay, so judging from that, it isn't the content, it isn't the topic of the activity, but the activity itself. And so when we took a look at all these various activities by examining existing curricula and textbooks, by examining different types of activities that are being offered in out-of-school time programming, what we found was that you can begin categorizing those types of learning activities into different groups. I came up with 7 groups. And actually, I came up with 6 groups, and my daughter corrected me, and I had to split one of these. And actually, I split caretaking and teaching. She informed me that just because you're teaching somebody, it is nothing like taking care of an animal in a class or something like that. So I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. Okay, so then I broke those apart, and so now we have these. They're more or less self-explanatory. But if you have any questions about what these mean, please ask. Okay, I just carried out a workshop at Yale University about 3 days ago, so I've been doing a lot of traveling. Unfortunately, it's boosting up my frequent flyer miles. I carried out a workshop at Yale University, and there, with the teachers that I was talking to, we went over each of these different types of, each of these categories, these types of learning activities. And one point that I wanted to drive home is the variation within them. Okay, there are different degrees of competition, different degrees of collaboration, different degrees of creating and making that students would be engaged in. And so what that's allowing us to do, when we take a look at this, when you take a look at a program, there's degrees of collaboration. And so when you go from one program to another program, that's something that if 2 programs are involved collaboration, that's not it. I mean, that's not the end of it. It's important to also look at what degree of collaboration each of these programs have, and that allows you to another level of sophistication that you can bring to the analysis. Are there any questions?
And you have 2 things going on at the same time?
Absolutely. You can have 7 things going on at the same time.
Right.
When you take a look at first robotics, for example, this is one of those things. Is and there's also this kind of, you call it best robotics. All right, so they actually have all 7 of these things integrated. As a matter of fact, you can, as a classroom teacher, you could probably easily integrate 3 or 4 or 5 of these things simultaneously within a single lesson. So the reason for using or applying this framework is to allow individuals who are teaching in different content areas to spend some time conversing about the pedagogical approaches that they're applying in their classrooms. What's interesting here is I had some history teachers come to the workshop at Yale, because this allows history teachers actually to compare what they're doing in terms of collaboration and competition in their classrooms when they're talking to science teachers. And the same thing with across different content areas. This is not limited to science by any stretch of the imagination. It's much broader than that. And it was intended to do that because of the variation in content areas. Now, there we go. Okay, so I developed a questionnaire, and if you're interested, please email me, and I will send you the most advanced version of this. With several questions under each of the various headings, and I don't expect you to read it. I just want to show you that there are a lot of them. Okay, so we've done a fair amount of confirmatory factor analysis, looking at the behavior of these things in terms of students' responses to the surveys. So there we go. We also developed a series of questionnaires that we have implemented across various school districts. And when we survey students, our tendency is, I know this looks pretty elementary, but it's it's easily understood by young people, and old people don't typically get offended by that. They just smile. Okay, so they kind of get the idea of what's going on here. So with the surveys, and we have a multi-age surveying with this project. And so, okay, so the data that I'm about to show you in this analysis was actually gathered from 4 public school districts in the United States. So here's how we did it. we went to a school district and said, hey, can we survey all the students in your school district from 3rd to 12th grade? And I did not do this. I sent one of my former graduate students, now a professor, to do this, who had a very strong relationship with that school district and knew the superintendent really well. And the superintendent was like, yeah, sure, why not? Okay, and so that's what they allowed us to do. We would go into the schools and survey all the students 3 through 12 that were present in any given day, and we'd leave a few surveys behind for those that were absent. The schools were urban, suburban, and rural in terms of urbanicity. Overall, the sampling had about 20% African American and about 20% Latino. And that's summed over all the various school districts. So in some of the school districts, we had predominantly African American students. In other school districts, we actually had predominantly Hispanic students. But when you summed all the surveys together, that's what it looked like. Overall, in the data I'm about to show you, there were about 7,000 students that were surveyed, and it was roughly equally partitioned across each of the different grade levels. Any questions so far? Sure? No questions? And split evenly male-female, which is not a giant surprise. Okay, so let's take a look at some of this data and what it is that we're seeing. When we ask the students a question about within the discovering category, right? How do you feel about problem solving? Is it something that you enjoy doing versus don't enjoy doing? This is a response that we got. And I'm comparing males to females, okay? And here's what we were finding. Do you see right here, there are about, here for 4s and 5, positive responses for roughly 40% of the students for problem solving. When you look down here to the females, you can see that overall, there's a difference compared to the males, slightly lower. Okay? Now, this is a comparison across grades 3 through 12. Bear this in mind. So, what I'm asking you to do here is not to look at this longitudinally. This is not longitudinal data. This is cross-grade comparison. Okay? Now, a lot of people, when they look at this, like, wow, look at those. As they get older, no, let's get away from that, okay? We're looking at the older students tend to be less enthusiastic than the younger students about this type of activity. So now, let's move on to a different formatting of the question. And this is comparing problem solving to, hello, there. Figure out how things work. Do you see the difference there? Okay. Much more positive response from the male grouping, from the male students overall. You see they're really clumping up here. Okay. You look down here for females, it is more positive. Okay, but at the same time, it is also much more spread out. Any questions about this? Yes, no? Am I confusing you? This is pretty straightforward. Okay. All right. So I'll flash back and forth between the two again. Problem solving and figuring things out. Okay, so let's go on to another category. Creating, making. The question asked students, do you enjoy making things? And this is the response that we got. Okay? Then we changed the wording of the question. Do you enjoy building things? Do you see the difference? This is make. This is build. Down here at the female. Okay? This is make. This is build. We notice a pretty stark difference between how females and males were approaching this. Okay? So also something else that you should bear in mind about this. These totals down here are all non-zero. There's some students that just don't like doing this kind of stuff. Okay. The other thing too is you can see the younger students tend to be more enthusiastic about this than the older ones. Okay. No questions? Good? Okay. So we'll move on to collaborating. What struck me as most interesting about this is how similar from group to group to group the students were. Okay, from across all the grade ranges, the response distribution seems to be very, very stable. Now this is one of those kinds of things where I would look at it and go, you know what, if you get data that's all over the place all the time, the instability of that makes you wonder whether or not you're actually measuring something, right? So the expectation is there would be some of these categories where they're very stable, and what we're seeing repeated over and over again is actually happening. Okay, and so we're seeing some stability here in terms of students reporting their attitude towards collaborating. This is a single question. I can provide more detail on that if you're interested. Here's the response of students for competing. Do you notice the difference in male versus female responses? Okay, it's very flat for females, and it certainly edges up for males. Is this surprising? Okay. In my high school physics class, when I was a high school physics teacher, we had a lot of competition-based activities. Right? We win this, we win that. I thought this was encouraging my students to participate in class. Bearing this kind of data in mind, this suggests that maybe you might be attracting a lot of males into a male-oriented physics class already, right? And you're leaving out a lot of females in that type of scenario. That said, this is non-zero. So there are some females that are going to be part of this, okay, which is likely what we're seeing. So is your program, if it's competition-based, more focused? Does it tend to attract more females than males? If that's happening, then what that suggests, if you're a programmer, is that you might need to do some different things to draw in more female students. And you might need to couple your activity with other types of activities. Do you notice here with performing? Is this a surprise to you? It's not a surprise, yeah. You know, and you realize the thing that's ranked just slightly ahead of combat is public speaking in terms of stress generation, right? I believe it's just slightly ahead of combat, or it might be slightly behind. I don't know, but it's right up there. Okay, so you can see. So when I'm talking about performing here, this is where you are responsible for doing something at a particular time. Okay, so you need to be, you're given the responsibility of doing something at a particular moment in time. So that means if you are, doing an egg drop competition, that means when you're dropping your device. Okay, is that performing this? Yes, it's performing, but in a different way as opposed to giving a soliloquy in front of a classroom. Okay, but it's very similar in terms of the stress, because here you are dropping something that you spend so much time building. So you can see here with the males, it's flat, but there seems to be a little tendency towards negativity here that's more evident than you would see for the females, slightly. Question? Yes?
When you were on the competition slide, I was expecting you to back up to the collaboration side instead of put it forward to performing. So, can we look at the collaboration
sure.
one more time? Let's take a look. Well, it's not that.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out how to forward here. Okay, so this is collaborating. So the kids are much more positively oriented towards working with one another.
So that's what I thought the answer to the competition then was going to be, was more collaborative activities instead of switching out performing. But
yeah.
I guess I'm just thinking two dimensional.
No, that's okay. That's okay. So this is what I'm saying is, but a lot of these activities do involve working together, but is that culture being promoted as something that's and I'm glad you pointed that out. I might switch those in the future. So let's see. Here's performing. I'll get this red symbol.
Interesting.
You see caretaking? It's a funny thing about caretaking. Do you see this right here is actually dominating? Males are neither plus nor minus. That seems to be the most popular response. Females are actually more positive towards this in general. Yes?
It could be the case that if they're not sure of an opinion, they just pick 3.
What's that?
It could be the case that if they're not sure of an opinion, they don't really have a almost
That's
like
right.
doorstep opinion. They just generically pick 3.
That's right. And then that's what I would hope that they would do, right? Is they would pick something right in the middle, and they're not, you know, I can take it or leave it. Okay, culturally speaking, caretaking is not strongly integrated into a lot of the physical science instruction that's out there. It is more typically integrated into biological sciences. And when you start looking at what's going on in terms of female under-enrollment in certain areas, you see a much stronger female enrollment in biological sciences and a much weaker female enrollment in physical sciences. And what that's suggesting to me is like, well, you know what, maybe we should use a different technique here. Maybe some of the learning activities that we're engaging students in, is there caretaking in the physical sciences? Think about that. But what I suggest you do is to think beyond the actual learning activities for the content. And think in terms of longer range things, right? Caretaking in terms of mechanical engineering. Well, there's certainly work that's being done with engineering prostheses, engineering that goes into wheelchair development. There's a lot of work that's being done in a lot of different areas. When you start looking at physics, right, there's that's work that's being done in radiology that's very important. And so the idea of making these types of activities available to students so they understand that this is something they can potentially go into, it's being left out to a large extent in the physical sciences. So I think it's worth investigating. Do I have the answers for this? No, I'm not suggesting this is the answer for this. I'm just saying, hey, this is something that's out there that certainly bears us taking a closer look. Okay.
Robert, what I found really interesting are the patterns. How similar the patterns are, that if it's going up for one grade level, it seems to go up for another and another and another.
Yeah, I know, isn't that funny?
Yeah, it really is amazing to me. Now we've got something interesting going on.
The third and fourth graders are very similar. They almost always overlap, right? So here's elementary school, pretty stark. Okay, and then you're right. I mean, you look at these guys over here, right? Especially down here. This is really stunning to me.
Yeah, it is
right?
to me too. It just kind of.
These are completely different students in completely different schools across the country. Okay, well, primarily in Virginia and Indiana.
That they would all dip at 2, and they would all kind of
Peak.
come up a little bit at 3.
But yeah, but they're different. So you know, it's sort of shifted.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is something, and bear in mind though, these are mutually exclusive. So if it's high on this end, it's going to be lower on that end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So
Okay,
it's a forced choice 1.
Exactly, 1 through 5. Forced choice 1 through 5. Okay, so we'll move on to teaching. And you can see here with males, okay, weaker interest expressed among the older students, and here with females, it's moderately stronger. And when we look at the teaching force in across the United States, it's primarily dominated by females, especially at the elementary level. Okay, questions? I'm going to stop asking them. No, I'm sorry. Okay, so let's take a look here in terms of preferences. You know, there are youth who have preferences for particular types of learning activities more likely to select STEM-related choices than youth who have different preferences. Okay, and particular types of preferences. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to perform a logistic regression. And I'm going to control for the usual suspects in terms of, gender differences, males, females, that type of thing. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in one at a time a composite variable for each one of these 7 different areas. and use that as a predictor of their likelihood to choose either a science-related job versus a non-science-related job.
Okay, now my counter would be, why didn't you do it separately for boys and girls?
You know what? Because this is only like a 45-minute presentation, and you do that, and it's that would be the only reason. We did, though. Okay, we got very similar results. Okay, so here we go. But you see, we're getting an answer for everything. Okay, so let's take a look. So each one of these is a separate model. Okay, and all I'm doing is comparing the odds ratios. That's all I'm doing. I'm just comparing odds ratios. Okay, each one of these separate models includes background variables. Okay, so this graph is intended to compare odds ratios. What are we seeing? This is reverse coded collaborating. So you see these big positive numbers. What does that mean? Yeah, science kids don't like to hang out with other people. They like doing stuff by themselves. And it is kind of weird, but is that surprising when you think about science instruction in a lot of classes? Kids don't, and it's like, yeah, I don't want to be in a group because I'm going to end up doing all the work. Okay, and I was one of my students actually, she sent me a tweet, you know, and I thought this was pretty funny. She says, yeah, this is about group work, because I was talking to my students about group work that particular day, and she says, she sent me the tweet, and the tweet says, you know what, when I die, I want my group members to lower me in the ground, because then that way they can let me down one last time. Someone had a bad day. Someone had a really bad day with collaboration. Yeah. So, you know, but looking back up here, this is less surprising. You see, these guys are much more positively oriented, right? And you have discover being here at the top. Discover, problem solving, figuring things out, stuff like that. And then making, creating, okay, more engineering associated ideas. So let's say, again, these were not particularly strongly associated one way or the other. Okay? So let's take a look here. If you put the numbers into the comparison and you start comparing particular values of individuals. Okay? So what is this saying here? Among elementary school students, right, you're comparing neutral to slightly positive, 4. So the likelihood, so if you would see here, there are 38% greater odds. But when you compare the neutral to a student that was highly positive, they're much stronger. But what's pretty stark is when you get down here for middle school, with this percentage, and for high school students, and you have these percentages. So the likelihood of choosing, they're starting to associate these types of activities with doing those types of jobs. Okay? One of my graduate students, being the anal person that he is, I said, you know what, it would be really good if, you know, if I could get you to sit down and take a look at some of these textbooks and go over them in terms of the curricula that's in it, right? Certain lesson plans and things like that, and analyze it according to this framework. Just to give us an idea, let me know, just an idea of what the orientation is of these things. So 13 books and 796 activities later, he came back and he said about 90% of the activities involved discovery. 0. None of them. None of the 796 involve caretaking.
Involve what?
Caretaking. 0. No, it just wasn't what was done. So it's not a surprise that students are starting to associate doing this kind of thing with doing science. But science is so much more than that. So is every other activity. Okay. So, with respect for aspirations for STEM-related careers, here's what I want to do. Here's the gender comparison that you're talking about, right? We wanted to take a look at gender differences and the difference between males and females in terms of what they expect. And this is not the FOCIS framework stuff. This is just gender, okay, across 3 different grade levels. And this is what we found. The data here shows that the split across genders is fairly even across the data set. And we have a pretty fair number of students in each of the groups, enough to suggest that we would be able to find something. We had enough statistical power to find something. And here are the odds ratios that were generated from this. So what is the likelihood, if you're at the elementary level, to choose science as something you would like to do when you grow up? Okay, you're 3 times more likely to be a boy than a girl. It's already started in elementary school. This is a massive odds ratio. Okay, to give you an idea, logistic regression is a technique used very, very commonly in medical studies. If you find a significant difference with a 1.2 or 20% different odd ratio, that is enough to stop a medical study and start treating the people with the treatment. Okay, so this is many times larger than that. It's a very, very large outcome. So the gender differential in terms of attracting females versus males into science-related areas has already begun before they even reach middle school. Back to the original study that I talked about from 2006, we see that if we're going to have the impact that we want to have on young children in terms of opening up the potential careers that they might go into, we really have to begin opening up the idea of consideration of these things instructionally across different areas to students younger and younger. We shouldn't just think, you know what, they're not making their decisions yet until like high school. Maybe sooner than that. They've already made some choices in terms of their identification of what they would go into. Okay, so back to the FOCIS framework. The fundamental utility of this approach is so that it would allow you the ability to apply this framework and compare 2 very, at least superficially, different curricular approaches by analyzing the learning activities as opposed to getting stuck with the content and saying, well, you know, I've got a math activity over here, I've got a history or science activity. Well, hang on a second. Let's look at what the students are actually being asked to do, apart from the content. And then compare the collaboration, compare the competition, or compare the degree of each of these learning activities that's being applied. And it may offer us some means of making direct comparisons across different topic areas. Okay, so let's see. Oh, there you go. These are the people who paid for this. And here's some of the people that really helped me out. So I like saying this kind of stuff, you know, bear with me. She's a consultant with, in Washington, D.C. He's an assistant professor at James Madison. She's an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth. She's in Germany working for the Institute of Science Education with Kyle, and he's sitting in my lab right now working on something. Yeah. So if you have any questions, please contact me. I'd really love to hear from you. So, are we good? Any questions?
I've loved you since I first saw you.
You get that reaction?
Oh, yeah. Let me go. Yeah. All right, so do you have any questions for me? Yes?
I think one of your last slides was most interesting, actually, the 3-to-1 ratio. Because if they have such a strong opinion by elementary school, it almost posits case to go back and give a survey to the parents. Because if they have that opinion by elementary school at such an early stage in their schooling, something culturally is going on and something external from the school in terms of home environment, nature-nurture aspects is kicking in.
You know, that's something that is really interesting. I couldn't separate that out because of the way that we approach the study. It's a large-scale survey study, and you go in and survey all of these kids, right? I mean, it's certainly using a qualitative approach where you go in and interview kids and get to know them a little better to see what kind of potential mechanisms that might be at play. That is something that it bears watching. You know, it's something that I think is really important for us to look into, is how much impact the home environment is having on the students. It clearly has some, it has a, you know, a big impact. What's interesting is that we're finding this across students that vary in terms of their home environment. There's a lot of natural variation in terms of that. This is still peeking its head out.
But they're all watching the same TV.
Yeah, maybe so. But anyway, yes. Any other questions?
What are your interests in instructional innovations and implications for this? What are you thinking about?
What I want to do is to use this technique. In terms of actual instruction myself, I don't design the instruction. Okay, so I take a step back. What I want to do is I want to study the instruction that others have designed and are implementing with students. What I'm most interested in finding out is what types of longitudinal effects certain types of instructional approaches might be having with students. That's what I want to know. So you have these various programs. I mean, there are a lot of really good programs that are out there. I'm not going to say I'm going to design something that's you know, it's going to be incredibly whatever. But there are a lot of really great programs. There's the First Robotics League. There's a Junior First Lego League. Those are a couple over there from this First branded group. If you look at the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts, they certainly have activities. 4-H has activities that are built in. So, and then you look into school curricula. There's some really good school programs that are being offered. And so each of these types of programs has some degree of different combination of learning activities, and also variation within those types of learning activities in terms of how much collaboration or how much competition is involved. And I just think that the framework would allow me to go in there, capture that information, and then if by performing a longitudinal study, see whether or not there are certain types of student backgrounds and these learning activities that might be more strongly associated with certain types of outcomes later on. And this is sort of this is largely non-judgmental in a way. And what I mean by that is where the kids end up in terms of what I don't see them going into other topic areas, mathematics, history, you know, retail sales, as, you know, a loss. What I see that is, you know, of the ones that have gone into science, what type of experiences they have, and if I want to increase the likelihood of students going into those areas, then we can talk about how these programs are structured that are more positively associated with that type of outcome. Does that make sense? Yeah,
but I think you have to have a prospective approach to this also, to do some demonstration that that probability does increase associated with an activity that has more of these things and an activity that doesn't. And otherwise, you have this potential to capture the selectivity effect, and that then confounds all this.
Oh yeah, I mean we are, you know, in terms of the research design, that's a huge consideration. And you know, there is a study that I'm currently trying to get funded that would involve some randomization of participation and through certain programs that would allow us to get at some of that and address some of the confounding factors. Question?
Yeah, I think it's a unique perspective to examine students' learning experience. But I'm just curious, how did you come up with these 7 categories? Maybe I missed that part.
Oh, yeah, I made them up.
Yeah.
No, that's how I came up with it. I'm absolutely, I mean, you know, I sit there and you know, what I did was I looked at existing curricula and also existing programs from a lot of different areas. And then when you begin looking at the activities that the students are being asked to engage in, these types of categories just come out from looking at that. And so, you know, when you look at Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts activities versus 4-H versus what's going on in classrooms, from these different types of curricula, you see that the students are asked to work together in groups, and you see that the students are asked to compete or not compete in some instances. And these types of pedagogical differences begin to rise. from that. And so that's how I came up with these categories. And I know it sounds, you know, like, wow, geez. You know, could somebody else have done this? Yeah. Did? No. So there you go. Yes?
So everything you've shown us so far has been self-reported?
In terms of the students?
Yeah.
Yes.
It'd be interesting to go to the classroom and code what's going on.
You know,
the students are saying, oh, we collaborated.
Yeah.
But maybe they just sat together doing the same activity. It's not actual collaboration.
Well, you know, there's a difference between asking them whether or not they prefer to collaborate versus going into a classroom and doing an observation for that type of thing, and that's absolutely right. So I actually am developing an iPad app right now that would allow us to go in there and do multiple observations over very short periods of time with numbers of children. And it would be on task or off task. In other words, it would just be a very simple question that the observer would have to record data for. And it's based on single subject research design approach where you know, you do lots and lots of observations and you try to capture changes in students' behavior as the lesson progresses or as the activity progresses over time, and see if you can match shifts in their behavior with shifts in the lessons. So yeah, we're looking into that right now. I actually have a prime grant from NSF where the survey in terms of student preferences is part of that. That's one part of the tools that I'm developing. The other would be the iPad app, and the third would be the analytical protocol for various types of programs and learning activities. So you put the three together, and then hopefully you capture some interesting data for what people are doing. Questions? Anything else?
Can you explain the, like, for example, caretaking to the students before the survey?
Oh yes, it is actually. And for the older ones, they kind of get that. For the really young ones, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, okay, the teachers actually read the questions to them as they go through it. And if the kids have questions about what it means, they raise their hands. So that's how we're able to, and to be honest with you, we're kind of bumping up against how young the kids can respond to surveys. But that said, you know, you can always say, well, they're too young and they can't respond to surveys, you know, at whatever grade, and then never bother capturing the data. Or you can capture the data and realize that, you know, it's not perfect data, maybe you shouldn't, you know, rely on it. So we decided to capture the data and see whether or not we can rely on it. And what this suggests to me is maybe we should go to 2nd graders and 1st graders and see what happens.
Do you have some data on stability of these preferences?
That's what we're collecting right now. We've gone to these school districts and we collected one round in the fall 2 years ago. We came back and collected a 2nd round of data from the same schools and the same children 6 months later. And then we collected data again when they were a year older, the fall the following year. And then we collected data for a 4th time that we just finished this past June and May and June. So we actually have 4 waves of data from the same groups of students that we're doing an individual match over time with right now. And yes, we've had some attrition, but the numbers are still looking pretty good, right around, I think, 5,000 students we've managed to capture data for all those times. So that's really something to look at the stability of that. And it's pretty hopeful from the initial analysis that we've done so far.
I was just wondering at certain points, puberty, for example, you might see less stability at certain times as kids are going.
You know, it'd be really interesting.
Grades, and it actually might reflect.
We have enough numbers, right, to be able to compare grade-wise over time to see whether or not that
really
is
interesting.
maybe concern. Yeah. Okay. So, any more questions? All right, thank you.
Let's give it a round of applause. Feel free to stay and have more food and on the time.